Now, I know the quality of this video is awful, but one is not too good with video stuff. So, this is a video to answer one of those by Gentleman's Gazzette, whom by the by I absolutely adore and have learned a lot from them. But it was about the one, about the definition of the term classic. What is or what is not classic menswear? And unshakably, their very conception of what makes or undoes something classic is utterly erroneous and nonsense. So forth. It is the black chap talking in that video. I mean, people who dress like me would know what I'm talking about, probably. And he explains that anything post 1970 or even 1960 cannot be considered classic for instance, any fashion that was installed post 1970 will not be considered classic, in view that, for instance, when I'm thinking about something that came into fashion post 1970, well, for example, turtleneck sweaters worn with a man's soot coat, like that one. And he explains that this cannot be considered classic, since initially the turtleneck sweater, well, he does not talk about the turtleneck sweater, this is my example, that the turtleneck sweater was not initially created to be worn on its own with a soot coat. Or better example, that jeans that began being worn in the 1970s by fashionable people as a fashion thing instead of mere cow keepers to ride upon their horses. For the first time in the 70s, a lot of people, even persons of the elite, would wear jeans as part of a fashion thing. And he says, I think he talked about jeans, I mean, I saw this video months ago. He says that, well, initially jeans were created, well, at least I know when jeans were created. I mean, the blue jean was first worn in the 1830s or 40s by gold miners in order to do hard and heavy work. And so forth, that the fashion which came in the 1970s, or post 1970, to wear, for example, a formal soot coat with a pair of jeans cannot be considered classic, since initially soot coats and jeans did not go together. Well, all of that is bogus, since, for instance, a coat, take for instance the modern, let us compare 2020's fads, it'll be easier. So nowadays in 2022, many men would wear a soot coat with simply a t-shirt. And he, from Gentleman's Gazette, the dark-skinned head, I forgot his name, he would say this is not classic, since initially a soot coat would not be worn with a t-shirt. And by the by, the t-shirt, initially, well, it was an undergarment, thus it would never be worn upon its own except by the vast majority of people, in fact, that belong to the working class, but it would never be worn simply with a soot coat. Thus forward, there are two huge problems with conceptions like that. And the foremost being that today's fashion, for instance, of wearing a soot coat with a modern t-shirt, that of a modern, fashionable, skinny soot coat from H&M, for instance, worn with a Zara men's t-shirt, whatever. Well, this is the issue. They are modern. Thus forward, to say that initially a soot coat was not worn with a t-shirt is like saying a modern human is not a human because initially humans were living in the savannah in Africa and did not wear any clothes. Well, yes, but a modern human has evolved since then. What I mean to say is, a soot coat made in 2022 by H&M is completely different from a soot coat made in 1900 or even in 1940 by Henry Pull & Co., for instance. And my soot coat that I'm wearing now is actually a uniform from James Webb Academy, and it probably dates from around 2010, to the school I used to attend to. And already it looks quite different from a soot coat made by H&M today. So, to say a soot coat wearing with a t-shirt, to get back to the example, so a modern H&M, very slim cut, polyester, crappy soot coat wearing with a cotton Zara men's t-shirt. Well, they are what they are today, that is. It has nothing to do with an undershirt of 1900 and a soot coat of 1900, for instance. Now, it gets confusing with menswear. For example, my coat that I'm now wearing, it is rather classic in terms that coats similar to that in terms of cut and little details, like for example the two buttons there, the lack of stitches upon the lack of cuffs, that began appealing in the 1910s for the first time. Although they would have been considered very modern and trendy then, they would not have been exactly like that. So much, I mean, they would have been made out of natural fibers, not polyester like this thing. And the cut may not have been exactly the same, but apart to a trained eye like I, it'd basically be exactly the same coat. So what he means is really his own conception of classic, which is what most people, most men would dress very formal and or very old-fashioned, like Sven Raphael Schneider, who is the head of Gentleman's Gazette. He dresses more like in the 1950s, 40s. I'm trying to emulate the Victorian era. There's another chap called Helen White who dresses also trying to emulate the Victorian era, and the chap from Vintage Butch called Nikolai something. But what I mean by classic is probably anything which was standard from the late 19th century, early 20th, or between 1920 and 1950, and not only was it worn then, but worn by most men not belonging to the working class, but more to the elite, from the elite, starting from the top elite to the bottom of the middle class. The working class depended whether they could afford it and or whether their job even allowed them to wear such fashionable clothes. I mean, if they were working in a blasted sewer, trying to clean it in 1898, they would not be wearing a soot. They had to wear work clothes, but then they might have worn a soot, emulating what the elite wore during the weekends spent in a pub. And in such a case, perhaps they sort of were classic in that term, in that it might have been a dark, rather conservative ensemble. Whereas, for example, Oscar Wilde, a famous man who did bad things to children, well, he was famous for, although he lived in the late 19th century, he was famous for not dressing classic. He was famous for wearing green, like apple green ensembles and all that. To get back to the subject at hand, what this brown, I forgot, well, the new chap in Gentleman's Gazette, two fellows, apart from Sven Raphael Schneider, one was even skinnier than I, and the other one is dark. So, and I forgot his name. So, the definition about classic, it is utterly, what they mean is basically the standards of fashion were in the Western world, that of the United States of America, well, the Western world back then. So today, more of the world is Western, more of the world has adopted the ways of my ancestors, basically, the Goths, the Germanics, whatever you call them. But back then, less people had, in terms of percent, for obviously there were also less people on Earth. So the entire definition becomes different. But, so what he means is, well, the fashions of the Western world basically back then it was United States of America and Europe, at least part of Russia and whatever. And what they were wearing as part of fashion, what most men, what most codes, for there were a lot of codes and dress codes, what most men deemed appropriate, what was deemed appropriate by that society at that time to wear in terms of fashion. But it was not necessarily classic. I mean, for instance, they consider these very high and stiff shirt collars that I sometimes wear, that for instance, that were popular during, basically came into being. I mean, these super high ones, I sometimes wear one of those. They first appeared in 1892, but they really became a thing from 1894 to practically disappear by 1920, at least in terms of most people. So the Gentleman's Gazette fellows and even most old-fashioned fellows today will not consider that a classic thing, since it was extremely exaggerated. I mean, a collar that tall and super stiff and super skinny like the one Karl Lagerfeld wore. And it was only popular for, 25 years? But then again, not many people were wearing these super extreme ones, which covered the entire neck, and which are torture to wear. Only a few would, and then again, only for a few occasions, perhaps only for the weekend and so forth, simply it would cause too much pain. Some persons actually died from those by fainting. Never mind. So, I mean, but 25 years is a lot. I mean, 25 years, these things were popular. At least, especially if one does not take into account this super full-length one, but those ending there. Well, these ones were popular, even some were still well until 1930 by older gentlemen. I mean, they were popular for 25 to... I mean, the slightly shorter ones even began in the early 1880s, or at least by 1885. So they would have been there for at least 25 years. And yet they are not considered a classic today, simply because what happened was, one has to understand history as a whole. And until quite recently, until the 1920s, so basically when fashion began, whether it be furniture-wise or clothing-wise, in the Middle Ages, in the 13th century. And it was about showing one's wealth. Most people lived in absolute poverty. So it was about changing the fashion, ergo that the more one changed it, whether it be the furniture or stationery or clothes were, the more demanded one was high in society, the more demanded one could afford to change things. And by 1920, everything had changed to the postmodern era. And by that meaning, by the 1920s, had factories everywhere, mass-producing everything from condoms to automobiles. That's forward. Changing one's outfit, changing the complete look of the fashions, so that within a decade, it would look entirely different. It was no longer necessary. I mean, look, especially at women's fashion, from 1880 to 1890, and it is barely recognizable. Whereas today, from 1920 to 2020, a whole 100 years, and a man's suit from 1915, especially 1920, 1925. Looks fairly similar. I mean, if a man wears, for example, me now, nothing is actually from the 19th century, nothing is original, although everything is at least a tenner. The trousers are from the 80s, probably from 1987, and they do not shock. People do not even know what I'm supposed to be dressed as. They do not know. If I tell them I'm trying to emulate the 19th century, they might believe me. I mean, for the late 19th century, because it does not look too dissimilar. I know it is not accurate. But if I'm saying I'm trying to dress like in the 1920s, it is almost spot on right, and yet nothing is a reproduction, nothing is an original from the 1920s. And I can tell the differences, but who can? Because since the 1920s, it became something different. You have to go now. Emily, you have to go?
Je sais pas, t'es encore en train de regarder là?
Yes.
C'est dans mes pauses, j'en sais rien. Ok, on continue encore.
So, by the 1920s, the era being post-modern, after the modern, everything changed. People began to be hygienic, to have well-organized cities. Poverty was not something that, it is there and people dying upon the streets. No, it becomes something that people wanted to stop, put means to stop. I mean, the world has never been so rich. People have never been so educated. And so the whole thing about fashion in a society that is so rich and where everything is mass-produced, it has almost become the opposite. Now, a person like me dressing like in the past, people might think I'm rich, although I'm not, because he dresses like in an older era. Back then it would have been the opposite. It would have been, he does not have the money to purchase something that is new. Because nowadays it has the money to get something old, but back then old things were affordable more than new things. But from the 1920s, everything switched around, and the more one advances into the future, the more it switches around. Thus forward, his definition of classic really applies post-1920, and perhaps what he means in his mind, he tries to apply it to an absolute thing. But it's completely not absolute. It only applies to 1920 until 1970 max, whereby the fashions, the very standards and codes of men's and women's, especially men's clothes and clothing in general, became standardized for the first time in society in a fixed time. I mean, for example, if one looks at a fashion plate from 1820s men's evening wear, comparing it to 1880s men's evening wear from the same country, from Britain, it looks drastically different. But comparing a photograph from 1920s men's evening wear to 1980s men's evening wear from Britain, so the same gap of years, 60 years only, there's barely a difference, not much. Since now, fashion is not about changing the entire thing, changing the entire cuts, changing the very codes. It is only about recycling what has been done between 1920 and 30, around the early 20th century. Upon this wise, when one understands it fully, as I do, one understands his erroneous definition in Gentleman's Gazette of classic. But in truth, it does not really mean anything the way he describes it, since before the 1920s, or at least 1910s max, things would change drastically, and for instance, the first short man's coat, as part of fashion and not workwear, were worn by fashionable men then, in the 1820s at least. But they looked completely different to those worn in the 1850s, and were worn in completely different contexts. By 1850, they could be worn in the city on a long day, on a relaxed day, not going to work, even by an aristocrat. But in the 1820s, that would not have been appropriate. It would only be worn as sportswear. So there, the same thing that happens today. Today, people are wearing jeans after 1970 as part of business wear, even because before it was only for workwear. If one was fixing one's garage. And thus, when the chap from Gentleman's Gazette says that this only began happening after 1970, or 1960, whatever he says, it is utterly false. It was there since the beginning that fashion began in the 13th century, the Middle Ages. That was when fashion first began. So, the terms classic or non-classic do not mean anything. For example, he might describe my outfit as being classic. He would describe it as classic, I'm sure, because they describe themselves as classic, and Sven Raffenschneider dresses in a similar mode as to how I am now dressed. But in truth, it does not respect any codes established ever that I know of in terms of color schemes and what goes with what. And in the absolute of the absolute, I have to. So do you need your phone now? No. Well, in the absolute of the absolute, this code all were very similar to the ones first invented, I would say around 1914, 13, it's very hard to know for sure. All very similar to those is not exactly the same. And first off, it is made out of polyester. Fabric never used, it had polyester already, but it never used it for proper men's clothing. It was actually used for workwear in some areas, uniforms of workmen. So even that coat in itself is not classic. To him it will appear as classic since it is more or less very similar to those that first began to appear, as I said, in 1914. Some might say it is even similar to those that began appearing in 1890 in a more dissimilar way. They already had things that looked like that, although not as much as those that first appeared in 1914. But in the absolute of the absolute, things, I mean, even reproductions are almost never accurate. Even when they use 100% wool. For example, I have a trousers from River Junction, reproduction shop that does reproductions from 1850 to 1900 of American men's clothes. And I got these trousers that my own mother thought they were originals from the 19th century. Because the wool used is the same texture. They only used wool, heavy wool, like they would back then, wool flannel. And even the lining was in pure cotton. But then I know for sure, although I cannot tell with my eyes, that it is not 100% accurate, because back then things were dyed with arsenic, and this is not allowed today. So when I got those in 2010 at the age of 14, I'm certain they were not dyed with arsenic. So in the absolute, it would be very hard to do an exact reproduction, something that would have been done probably the same way back then. And that's the reason for which I only concentrate my attentions upon originals as far as I can, except for things like boots. I cannot find my own shoe size. But because it isn't already possible to get the same, so the term classic, the way they apply it really only applies to their own view of what classic is. They will call this ensemble classic, but it is not. I mean, it is full of colors and this huge boutonniere, it looks more like something Oscar Wilde would have worn, and he was considered non-classic back then. So the very view of classic that they have is influenced by how the fashion is today. And today, when businessmen, I live in Dubai, and businessmen are going to work basically, practically wearing a tongue. Or, like in undergarments all of them, to meet her in undergarments, to meet a dresses like that. So to them, to Gentleman's Gazette, I am classic. But in truth, I'm simply wearing a 2010 bow tie from, I forgot the shop's name, it was an Italian shop. The shirt I got offhand from a charity shop in France. It's probably from the early 21st century, but it imitates sort of it wore the 1920s shirt. Again, imitate, not actual reproduction. This coat is a uniform coat. These trousers belong to my father and were from the 1980s. This hat is not worn by anybody now, but when with the ensemble it looks more old-fashioned, since hats, even from the 19th century, it had hats like that and looked very similar to those. But it is not even meant to be an imitation, but simply the style never really went out of fashion since 200 years. And so on and so forth. I mean, I got these socks from Brands for Less, because it's the only place in Dubai where I could find very long, classic-looking socks, but are not even meant to be adored or to emulate anything old-fashioned. Are simply long socks for diabetic people, thus forward to have no elastics, which are then more accurate for the time period I'm trying to emulate. So, classic, well, it does not mean anything, because even dress codes change. Even after 1920s, they change. Much less, as I explained it, but they do change a tad by tad by tad, and so forth. Today's black tie dress code, well, is hardly the same than what it was in the 40s, for instance, although not as drastically different as what they would wear in the 1920s. They did not call it black tie yet, I think, compared to the same difference that I just made, so compared to the 1840s. The difference is far from as much in terms of codes and what people actually wear, but it is still there.